Hi, my name is Fatima Tokmafshan. I am a volunteer with the Canadian Science Policy Conference here in Ottawa, the 10th conference. And I have with me Dr. Martha Crago, the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at McGill. And I have to say, I'm also a proud McGill alumna. I just graduated with a master's degree in human genetics. It's an absolute pleasure to sit down with you and I have a few questions to ask of you. So first of all, as a Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at McGill University, if you could tell me a little bit about the profile, the portfolio that you're handling, and whether it has any science policy facets to it.
Well, first of all, one of the great things about a job is involved in leadership in research, like a vice principal or vice president, is that you're working at an interface between government, university, industry, communities, and international. And so if you love interfaces, it's a great interface job. And the science policy part of it is, as you work in that interface, you need to figure out what can be the supports for research. And so if you take a proactive role, you then try to help work with the different research agencies to say, what are the needs we need to play well at this interface?
Very good. Now, you've held a number of positions that have had science policy aspects to them. For instance, the role of the Vice President of International Government Relations at Université de Montréal. And also you serve and you continue to serve on a number of boards of different entities that have science policy aspects, like NSERC, the Ocean Network Canada. In those roles, what sort of challenges and deficiencies you identified in terms of science policy? And in an ideal scenario, how would you or should you have dealt with those?
Okay, well, I think with the international one, the important thing is, and it's been important up until frankly now, that there was very little international funding. There was very little ways for Canada to play on an equal playing ground with other countries to support big global challenge areas of research or even small interesting areas of research internationally. So I kept trying to bring that forward in Ottawa. And fortunately, we brought it forward powerfully enough in the Naylor report that I think we're seeing some impact from it. The other things like Ocean Network Canada, that was a very interesting experience for me. And at the same time, I was on the synchrotron in Saskatchewan. And the big problem with those big science projects is they were funded on a certain program of CFI where you didn't need a match. And then it shifted that you needed a match. And these are so big and so expensive, these projects, that there was almost no way that people could get the match. And they would near having to decommission repeatedly, almost year after year. So the science policy report, the fundamental science report, also dealt with that, and we do need a really strong look at our big science projects. So that's an ongoing piece. Although I think the formula for the matches with CFI will change and be a little bit less onerous for some of these projects.
Okay, very good. Now I'm going to delve back a little into your background as a world-renowned scholar when it comes to language acquisition across a variety of learners and languages, namely your experience with Indigenous children learning their native languages. Now, in the context of truth and reconciliation, what would you like to advocate for, or what kind of policies, science policies, would you like to see?
Okay, well, first of all, this is shocking, but it's true, that when I did my first project in an Inuit community, I had to get a write-off to get my SSHRC grant and ethics approval. In those days, we just took a little piece of paper next door to the colleague in the office next door who knew nothing about Inuit communities. I mean, they were a neurosciences researcher, and that person would look at what I said I was going to do and sign the paper. There was no contact with the community, there was no discussion of human ethics. I mean, it was so superficial that it is remarkable. So now, switch to today, where really research should be co-constructed all the time with these communities, with their challenges, their needs being what researchers decide to address, and them wanting researchers to address with them. And they should be involved people on the projects, and that involvement should really be helping people get, if it's degrees that they still need or whatever, we should be moving this forward. And I will say we have some Indigenous languages in Canada that are still very strong, and there's no good reason we shouldn't be able to let our students write a thesis in one of those languages and have the examining committee be elders and scholars who know that language, because these languages are highly at risk, and to do scholarship in them will reinforce them very strongly.
Wonderful idea.
Yeah.
All right, so regarding the conference, you gave a couple of very interesting talks. I'm going to focus on the one that was titled Science and the Next Generation. If you could just, for our viewers, very briefly recap the main points that you brought up, and also any thoughts that you have in terms of inspiring marginalized groups, women, young women, Indigenous women, to partake in science and policy.
Okay, well, on that panel that happened this morning, I think the major topics that we were trying to come to grips with is how do we create better work across science with industry, science with government. And in particular with the government one, there are many vehicles we can use. We can actually co-fund infrastructure together, so we can share it with a government laboratory and get funding from government to do that. So there are ways that we can stop thinking of ourselves as on two sides of a wall. The terminology in Ottawa is intramural sciences, federal government scientists, and extramural are universities. Well, the notion here is let's co-locate some people, but in new and different ways. Intermingle rather than two buildings with, heavy-duty IDs having to be shown at a counter to get from one to the other. And let's share equipment and create hubs around which people do research together. So I think there's lots of interesting ways for us to start to get these boundaries more porous and get people to work. And that's the full weight of science in Canada. That's the warp and the weave of the fabric that we have here. And we should be using them to work together.
Yeah, and to engage and inspire a marginalized group and
right. So I mean that to me is slightly different. This is a kind of but that can happen through communities, and in one way is the community research we were just talking about. How do you engage people in that research, and how do you make sure they end up with a degree? I ended up with my PhD out of that work with Inuit. The people that worked hard on my project did not get a PhD. I did. So there ought to be ways that we can begin to engage them in projects, mentor them onward, and try to create educational programs that have significance to them.
Okay, very good. And I have one final question for you. What do you see as the biggest value of CSPC?
Well, I love it that it happens roughly in the same place every year. At the same time of year, so I can plan ahead for it, and I can come back and it's like a continuous dialogue. I see people from government, I see people from industry, we're all trying to solve problems together. I see older people like me, I see a wonderful generation of young people that have gotten interested in science policy. So it's a very vibrant conference these days, and one where you can go and connect up with a whole bunch of people in the space of a couple of days, and listen to interesting talks and begin to sort your way through it.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
And finally, if people are interested to learn more about you or what you do in your role, where can they get some more information?
Well, there is a website for research at McGill, and people can go to that, and I'm sure somewhere on it there's a little story of me. And it also tells the kinds of things we're working on for research at McGill, some of the strategic areas, some of the ways we're setting about that work.
Okay, very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. It was a pleasure.